Sarah Thompson stood in front of the ornate mirror in St. Michael's Cathedral's bridal suite, her trembling fingers adjusting the delicate lace veil for what felt like the 100th time. The room buzzed with activity as her three bridesmaids fluttered around her like butterflies in their pale pink dresses, yet she felt strangely alone in her thoughts. The elegant white wedding dress she wore, with its intricate beadwork and flowing train, had cost more than she made in 3 months at her job as a kindergarten teacher. Michael had insisted on paying for it, just as he had insisted on handling all the wedding expenses. Nothing but the best for my future wife, he'd said with that confident smile that had first attracted her to him 2 years ago. Through the stained glass windows, streams of colored light painted patterns on the cream-colored carpet. Sarah watched as her best friend and maid of honor, Jenny, arranged the bouquet of white roses and baby's breath on a nearby table. The flowers were perfect, just like everything else about this wedding. Too perfect, perhaps. "Sarah, honey, are you okay?" Jenny asked, noticing her friend's reflection in the mirror. "You look a bit pale. Do you need some water?" Sarah forced a smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just wedding day jitters, I suppose." But it wasn't just jitters, and deep down, Sarah knew it. The secret she'd discovered 3 months ago weighed heavily on her conscience, growing heavier with each passing day. It had started with a simple mistake. She picked up Michael's phone instead of hers one evening, thinking it was her own. The message that popped up had changed everything. 20 minutes until showtime, announced Lisa, one of the bridesmaids, as she waltzed into the room carrying a glass of champagne. "Should we do a final toast to the bride?" The other girls cheered, but Sarah felt her stomach turn at the thought of alcohol. She'd barely been able to keep down her breakfast that morning, and the idea of champagne made her feel even more nauseated. Outside the bridal suite, she could hear the growing murmur of guests arriving. 200 people had been invited, mostly Michael's business associates and their families. Sarah's own guest list had been modest, just 30 people including her immediate family and closest friends. She remembered how Michael had insisted on inviting all these people she'd never met, claiming it was important for his business relationships. Sarah's mother poked her head into the room, her eyes glistening with tears of joy. "Oh, sweetheart, you look absolutely beautiful," she gushed, walking over to embrace her daughter. The familiar scent of her mother's perfume brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "Mom," Sarah whispered, fighting the urge to tell her everything. But the words wouldn't come. How could she explain what she'd discovered? How could she tell anyone that the man she was about to marry wasn't who they thought he was? The clock on the wall ticked mercilessly forward. Each passing minute brought her closer to the moment she'd once dreamed about but now dreaded. Sarah remembered the night she'd found those messages on Michael's phone, the conversations that had made her blood run cold. She confronted him, of course, but his explanation had come with a warning. A gentle one, wrapped in a loving embrace, but a warning nonetheless. "Some business matters are better left unquestioned, darling," he'd said, stroking her hair. "Trust me, it's safer that way. For everyone." The implications of those words had kept her awake many nights since then. She'd thought about running away, about calling off the wedding, but fear held her in place like a butterfly pinned to a board. It wasn't just fear for herself, it was fear for her family, for her younger sister who had just started college, for her parents who had invested their retirement savings in one of Michael's special investment opportunities. A knock at the door startled Sarah from her thoughts. "5 minutes, ladies," called the wedding coordinator's cheerful voice. The bridesmaids burst into excited activity, helping Sarah with last-minute adjustments to her dress and veil. As Jenny carefully arranged the train, Sarah caught her own reflection in the mirror one last time. The woman staring back at her looked every bit the perfect bride, except for her eyes. Those eyes held a secret that was becoming harder and harder to hide. "It's time," announced her father, appearing at the door in his best suit, his face beaming with pride. Sarah took a deep breath, forcing down the wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. In a few minutes, she would walk down that aisle. In a few minutes, she would stand before God and everyone she loved. In a few minutes, she would have to make a choice, speak now, or forever hold her peace. Father James Richards stood at the altar of St. Michael's Cathedral, his weathered hand smoothing down his pristine white vestments. After 30 years of performing weddings, he had developed an almost sixth sense about ceremonies, and something about today felt different. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful shadows across the ancient stone floors. At 65 years old, Father Richards had seen it all: nervous grooms, crying brides, fainting best men, and even the occasional runaway bride. His experience had taught him to read people, to notice the small signs that others might miss. He took pride in this ability, considering it both a gift from God and a skill honed through decades of service. As he watched the guests file into the church, Father Richards noticed an unusual mix in the crowd. On one side sat a small group of people who seemed to be the bride's family and friends. They chatted warmly with each other, sharing gentle laughs and happy tears. The other side, however, was filled with men in expensive suits and women dripping in jewelry, their conversations more reserved, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. The groom, Michael Anderson, arrived early, accompanied by his best man. Father Richards observed as Michael checked his phone repeatedly, his movements sharp and precise. While most grooms showed nervous excitement, Michael displayed a cool confidence that seemed almost rehearsed. He wore an Italian suit that probably cost more than what most people earned in months, and his shoes gleamed like polished mirrors. "Beautiful day for a wedding, wouldn't you say, Father?" Michael asked, his voice smooth as silk. Father Richards nodded, but something in the groom's tone made him pause. In his 3 decades of service, he had learned that sometimes the most perfect-seeming people carried the darkest secrets. The priest began his usual pre-ceremony routine, checking that everything was in order. The marriage license lay ready on his desk, the rings were with the best man, and the unity candles stood prepared. Yet as he moved through these familiar tasks, a nagging feeling of unease grew in his stomach. From the back of the church, Father Richards could hear the whispered conversations of Michael's guests. Fragments of discussions about business deals and investments reached his ears, unusual topics for a wedding. He noticed how some of the men would huddle in small groups, speaking in low tones, only to break apart quickly when others approached. Mrs. Thompson, the bride's mother, approached him with tears in her eyes. "Father, we're so grateful to have you performing the ceremony today," she said warmly. "Sarah has been coming to this church since she was a little girl." There was something in her voice, pride mixed with worry, that caught his attention. As the church filled to capacity, Father Richards retreated to his small office for a moment of prayer, a ritual he performed before every wedding. But today, his prayers felt different. Instead of the usual blessings for the couple's happiness, he found himself asking for guidance and wisdom. The church organist began playing the prelude music, signaling that the ceremony would begin soon. Father Richards watched as the ushers guided the last few guests to their seats. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and roses, and the afternoon sun had shifted to create a golden glow throughout the cathedral. Through the years, Father Richards had developed certain traditions. Before each ceremony, he would look into the eyes of both the bride and groom, searching for the love that had brought them to this sacred place. He believed that eyes were windows to the soul, and in his experience, they never lied. Standing at the altar now, he observed Michael more closely. The groom's posture was rigid, his jaw clenched slightly. While most grooms fidgeted with excitement, Michael stood perfectly still, occasionally glancing toward the back doors of the church with what looked like impatience rather than anticipation. The wedding coordinator appeared at the side door, giving the signal that the bride was ready. As the organist transitioned to the processional music, Father Richards took his position. The familiar words of the ceremony ran through his mind, words he had spoken thousands of times before. But something told him that this wedding would be different from all the others. Looking out at the assembled guests, he noticed several men in dark suits standing at the back of the church, their attention focused more on the exits than on the ceremony about to unfold. In all his years of service, Father Richards had learned to trust his instincts. And right now, those instincts were telling him to be alert, very alert. The processional music swelled, and the great wooden doors at the back of the church began to open. The moment of truth was about to begin. The traditional wedding march filled St. Michael's Cathedral as the wooden doors swung open. First came the bridesmaids, walking gracefully in their pink dresses, followed by a small flower girl scattering rose petals. Then, the music swelled, and everyone rose to their feet as Sarah appeared in the doorway with her father. Father Richard's eyes narrowed slightly as he observed the bride. In his 30 years of performing weddings, he had seen countless brides walk down this aisle. Some were nervous, some were excited, Some were even crying with joy. But Sarah Thompson was different. Her face, partially hidden behind the delicate veil, showed signs of distress that went beyond typical wedding day nerves. As Sarah took her first steps down the aisle, Father Richards noticed her hands trembling violently around her bouquet. The white roses shook visibly, petals occasionally falling to join those already scattered by the flower girl. Her father held her arm firmly, perhaps sensing her unsteadiness. What caught the priest's attention most were Sarah's eyes. They darted frantically between the exit doors, never settling on her waiting groom. While most brides couldn't take their eyes off their future husbands, Sarah seemed to be calculating escape routes. When her gaze briefly met Father Richards, he saw raw fear in them. Halfway down the aisle, Sarah stumbled slightly. A collective gasp rose from the guests, but her father kept her steady. Michael's reaction at the altar was curious. Instead of showing concern, his jaw tightened, and he shot a quick glance at someone in the back of the church. Father Richards followed Michael's gaze and noticed one of the men in dark suits make a subtle hand gesture. The priest had worked in this church long enough to know when something wasn't right, and everything about this scene felt wrong. Sarah's mother, seated in the front row, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, but Father Richards noticed she wasn't wiping away tears of joy. Her expression showed worry as she watched her daughter's halting progress down the aisle. Next to her, Sarah's younger sister gripped the edge of the pew, so hard her knuckles had turned white. The walk that usually took 2 minutes seemed to stretch on forever. Sarah's breathing became audible as she got closer to the altar. Short, panicked breaths that reminded Father Richards of a trapped animal. Her makeup couldn't fully hide how pale she had become, and beads of sweat had formed on her forehead despite the church's cool temperature. When Sarah and her father finally reached the altar, tradition dictated that her father would lift her veil, kiss her cheek, and place her hand in Michael's. But Sarah's father hesitated, his hands lingering on his daughter's shoulders as if reluctant to let her go. Father Richard saw him whisper something in Sarah's ear, something that made her eyes fill with tears. Michael stepped forward, his expensive shoes clicking on the stone floor. He reached for Sarah's hand, and Father Richards observed how she flinched ever so slightly at his touch. It was subtle, so subtle that probably only someone watching as carefully as the priest would have noticed. As the couple took their places before the altar, Father Richards began the ceremony with the traditional opening words. His voice echoed through the cathedral, but his attention remained fixed on the bride. Sarah's tears, which had started during her father's whispered words, now flowed freely down her cheeks. "Dearly beloved," Father Richards continued, "we are gathered here today." While he spoke, he noticed Sarah's gaze repeatedly drifting to her family in the front row. Her mother was now openly crying, clutching her husband's arm. The contrast between the two sides of the church was striking. Sarah's small group of family and friends showed genuine emotion, while Michael's guests remained stoically observant. The sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows cast a rainbow of colors across Sarah's white dress, but instead of looking ethereal, she appeared almost ghostly in her pallor. Her bouquet continued to tremble in her hands, and Father Richards noticed she was swaying slightly where she stood. As he prepared to move into the exchange of vows, Father Richards saw something that deeply disturbed him. When Sarah glanced back toward the church doors again, Michael's hand tightened around hers in what appeared to be a warning gesture. The priest had seen enough domestic violence counseling cases to recognize the signs of control and fear. The cathedral fell silent, waiting for Father Richards to continue with the ceremony. But in that moment, as he looked between the nervous bride, the controlling groom, and the mysterious men watching from the back of the church, he knew he couldn't simply proceed as usual. Something had to be done, and he was the only one in a position to do it. The sound of Father Richards closing his prayer book echoed through the cathedral like a thunderclap. A murmur of confusion rippled through the guests as the priest stepped away from his podium, his expression grave but determined. "My dear friends," Father Richards announced, his voice carrying clearly through the church's sound system, "I must pause these proceedings for a moment." He turned to face Sarah directly, his kind eyes meeting her tear-filled ones. "My child, would you please join me in the sacristy? I believe we need to have a brief conversation." The reaction was immediate. Michael's face darkened with barely contained anger, and several of his associates shifted forward in their seats. The tension in the air became thick enough to cut with a knife. "Father," Michael said, his voice tight with controlled fury, "is this really necessary? Sarah is just experiencing some nerves. We can continue." "I'm afraid I must insist," Father Richards interrupted firmly. In his 30 years as a priest, he had never stopped a wedding ceremony like this, but he knew in his heart it was the right thing to do. "It will only take a few minutes." Sarah's shoulders sagged with what looked like relief. Her bouquet slipped from her trembling fingers, white roses scattering across the altar steps. When she tried to take a step toward Father Richards, Michael's hand shot out to grasp her wrist. "Sarah," Michael whispered, loud enough for only those at the altar to hear, "remember what we discussed." Father Richards watched this exchange with growing concern. He gestured to Mrs. Peterson, a longtime church volunteer who was sitting in the front pew. "Martha, would you please accompany us?" he asked, knowing that having another woman present would both protect propriety and potentially make Sarah feel safer. The silence in the cathedral was deafening as Mrs. Peterson made her way to the altar. Several of Michael's associates had risen from their seats, but they seemed unsure how to react to this unexpected development. Father Richards noticed them looking toward someone in the back row, apparently waiting for instructions. "Ladies and gentlemen," Father Richards addressed the congregation, "please remain seated. We will resume shortly." His calm, authoritative tone helped prevent immediate chaos, though confused whispers continued to circulate through the crowd. Sarah's parents exchanged significant looks, her father half rising from his seat before her mother pulled him back down. The fear and concern on their faces told Father Richards that they too had suspected something wasn't right with this wedding. As Mrs. Peterson reached them, Michael finally released Sarah's wrist. "This is highly irregular," he said through clenched teeth. "I must object." "Your objection is noted," Father Richards replied firmly. "But as the officiant of this ceremony and the priest of this parish, I have both the right and the duty to ensure everything is as it should be before proceeding with the sacrament of marriage." Sarah took a shaky step toward Father Richards, nearly tripping on her wedding dress. Mrs. Peterson quickly moved to support her, wrapping a motherly arm around the young woman's shoulders. The contrast between Sarah's terror and Michael's barely controlled rage was striking. "This way," Father Richards said gently, gesturing toward the wooden door that led to the sacristy. As they moved away from the altar, he heard the murmur of voices grow louder behind them. Someone called out Michael's name sharply, but Father Richards didn't look back. The short walk to the sacristy felt like crossing a battlefield. Sarah's steps became steadier the further they got from the altar, though she jumped at every sound. Mrs. Peterson kept her arm firmly around the bride's shoulders, murmuring words of comfort. Just before they reached the sacristy door, Father Richards heard quick footsteps behind them. He turned to see two of Michael's associates approaching, their expressions determined. Without missing a beat, the priest drew himself up to his full height. "This is a private church matter," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Anyone who attempts to interfere will be asked to leave the premises immediately." His voice carried the weight of moral authority, stopping the men in their tracks. As Father Richards opened the heavy wooden door to the sacristy, he saw Sarah's face in profile. Despite her tears and smeared makeup, her expression had changed. For the first time since she'd entered the church, she looked hopeful. The door closed behind them with a solid thunk, muffling the growing chaos in the main church. Now, in the quiet privacy of the sacristy, Father Richards would finally learn what dark secret had cast such a shadow over what should have been a joyous day. Inside the sacristy, the sounds from the main church became muffled and distant. Father Richards quickly locked the heavy wooden door behind them, while Mrs. Peterson guided Sarah to a comfortable chair near the window. The bride collapsed into it, her white dress billowing around her like a deflating cloud. "Would you like some water, dear?" Mrs. Peterson asked softly, already moving toward the small refrigerator kept in the corner. Sarah nodded weakly, her hands still trembling as she accepted the cool bottle. Father Richards pulled up another chair and sat across from Sarah, keeping enough distance to not overwhelm her. Years of counseling experience had taught him how to handle delicate situations like this. "Take your time, Sarah," he said gently. "You're safe here." Those 3 words, "you're safe here," seemed to break something inside Sarah. The tears she'd been fighting back during the ceremony now flowed freely. Mrs. Peterson handed her a box of tissues, then took a protective stance by the door. "I can't marry him," Sarah finally whispered, her voice hoarse. "I can't, but I don't know how to stop it. They'll? She broke off, looking around fearfully as if expecting to find someone listening. Father Richards leaned forward slightly. Who are they, Sarah? What are you afraid of? Sarah took a shuddering breath, twisting the tissue in her hands. 3 months ago, I found something on Michael's phone. Messages about money. Large amounts of money. She swallowed hard. At first, I thought it was just business, but then I saw names I recognized from the news. People who'd been arrested for drug trafficking and money laundering. Mrs. Peterson gasped softly, but Father Richards kept his expression neutral, encouraging Sarah to continue. When I confronted Michael, Sarah continued, her voice dropping even lower, he told me it was all legal business dealings. But then he started talking about how dangerous curiosity could be, how accidents can happen to people who ask too many questions. She looked up at Father Richards, her eyes wide with fear. He mentioned my sister's college campus by name, Father. He knew her class schedule. Father Richards felt a chill run down his spine. Did you consider going to the authorities? Sarah laughed bitterly. 2 of the men out there are the authorities. I've seen them at Michael's house, accepting envelopes full of cash. She twisted her engagement ring nervously. And then there's my parents. Michael convinced them to invest their retirement savings in one of his special opportunities. He said it would double their money in 6 months. Now I know it was just another way to trap me. The men watching the doors during the ceremony, Father Richards began. They're not here to celebrate, Sarah confirmed. They're here to make sure I go through with it. Michael needs this marriage to appear legitimate for some big deal he's planning. He told me that becoming his wife would mean I couldn't testify against him in court. Mrs. Peterson moved from the door to stand beside Sarah, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. You poor dear. No wonder you were trembling so. There's more, Sarah continued, seeming to gain strength from finally sharing her burden. Last week, I overheard Michael on the phone. Something big is supposed to happen right after the wedding. Something involving shipping containers at the port. I don't know the details, but the numbers they were discussing, millions of dollars. Father Richard sat back, processing this information. What had started as a concerning wedding ceremony had evolved into something far more serious. He thought about the men in the church, the implied threats, the money laundering, and the potential drug trafficking operation. Sarah, he said firmly, what you're describing is a major criminal enterprise. You need protection, and this information needs to reach the right authorities, ones who aren't compromised. But my family, Sarah started to protest, will be in far more danger if you go through with this wedding, Father Richards finished. Right now, we have an opportunity. Everyone who's involved is gathered in my church. The right authorities could. A sudden pounding on the sacristy door made them all jump. Michael's voice came through, hard and demanding. Sarah, this has gone on long enough. Come out now. Father Richard stood up, his decision made. He pulled out his cell phone, not the church's landline which might be monitored, and began dialing a number. I have a friend, he told Sarah quietly, a federal agent I trust completely. He can have a team here in 15 minutes, but you'll need to be brave for just a little while longer. Can you do that? Sarah looked at the door, then back at Father Richards. Slowly, she straightened her shoulders and nodded. Yes, she said, her voice stronger than before. Yes, I can. The next 15 minutes in St. Michael's Cathedral became a study in barely contained chaos. Outside the sacristy, Michael's voice had grown increasingly threatening, while inside, Father Richards spoke quietly but urgently into his phone, relaying crucial information to his FBI contact. The church is at 1425 St. Michael's Way, he said softly. Yes, multiple suspects present. At least 15 by my count. Some are armed. I saw shoulder holsters under their jackets. The bride has evidence of money laundering and drug trafficking operations. Sarah sat frozen in her chair, flinching at each pound on the door. Mrs. Peterson had positioned herself protectively between Sarah and the entrance, though her own hands shook slightly as she gripped her rosary beads. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. The silence that followed was somehow more frightening than the noise had been. Through the thick wooden door came the sound of multiple voices speaking in hushed, angry tones. They're going to try to break in, Sarah whispered, panic edging into her voice. Father Richards ended his call and turned to both women. Help is on the way, he assured them. But we need to be smart about this. Those men out there can't know that authorities have been contacted. As if on cue, a new voice called through the door, smoother, more reasonable. "Father Richards, this is Thomas Walsh, Michael's attorney. Perhaps we can discuss this situation like civilized people. I'm sure we can reach an understanding that benefits everyone." Father Richards recognized the implied threat in those carefully chosen words. He caught Mrs. Peterson's eye and gave her a subtle nod. They had worked together long enough to understand each other without words. "One moment, please," Father Richards called back, then whispered to Sarah, "When I open this door, let me do the talking. Whatever happens, stay behind Mrs. Peterson." Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. Father Richards straightened his vestments and moved to unlock the door. As it opened, he found himself face to face with not just the attorney, but Michael and 3 of his associates as well. "Gentlemen," Father Richards said calmly, positioning himself in the doorway so they couldn't see past him, "this is a private pastoral consultation." Michael tried to push forward, but Father Richards held his ground. Years of playing college football before entering the seminary had left him with a solid build that even age hadn't entirely diminished. "My bride needs to come with me now," Michael said, his carefully maintained facade cracking to reveal the anger beneath. "This farce has gone on long enough." "Mr. Anderson," Father Richards replied firmly, "as I said before, this is a church matter. If Sarah chooses not to proceed with the ceremony, that is her right under both church and civil law." The attorney, Walsh, stepped forward smoothly. "Father, surely you understand the awkward position this puts everyone in. There are 200 guests waiting, considerable expenses have been incurred, and certain business arrangements depend on today's timeline. My concern is only for the spiritual and physical well-being of my parishioners," Father Richards responded. Suddenly, a commotion erupted in the main church. Raised voices and the sound of running feet echoed through the building. Michael's head snapped around, his face darkening as he recognized what was happening before anyone else. FBI agents in tactical gear were pouring through every entrance of the cathedral. The wedding guests erupted into chaos, some running for the exits, others freezing in their seats, and Michael's associates reaching for weapons they shouldn't have had in a church. "FBI, nobody move. Hands where we can see them." The commands rang out across the sacred space. Michael spun back toward the sacristy, his hand reaching inside his jacket, but he found himself staring down the barrel of a gun held by an agent who had approached silently from behind during the confusion. "I wouldn't," the agent said calmly. "Hands on your head, sir." In a matter of minutes, the scene transformed completely. FBI agents efficiently separated the wedding guests from suspects, while Michael and his closest associates were handcuffed and led away. The attorney, Walsh, was quickly identified as a person of interest in their ongoing investigation. Father Richards kept Sarah and Mrs. Peterson safely in the sacristy until an agent came to escort them out. As Sarah emerged, she saw her parents rushing toward her, free from the threats that had held them captive to Michael's schemes. The cathedral, which had been prepared for a wedding, now served as a staging area for one of the largest organized crime busts in the city's recent history. Wedding flowers and tactical gear created a surreal contrast in the ancient church, while outside, news vans were already beginning to arrive. 6 months after the dramatic events at St. Michael's Cathedral, Sarah Thompson sat in Father Richards' office, sipping tea from a ceramic mug. The autumn sunlight streamed through the window, highlighting the positive changes in her appearance. The fearful, trembling bride was gone, replaced by a confident young woman with clear eyes and a genuine smile. "The last of the trials wrapped up yesterday," Sarah told Father Richards, setting down her mug. "Michael and most of his associates will be in prison for a long time. The FBI found over $50 million in drug money and evidence of corruption that went all the way up to the state level." Father Richards nodded, remembering the media frenzy that had followed the arrests. The story of the wedding that turned into a massive criminal bust had made national headlines. "And your parents' savings?" he asked. Sarah's smile brightened. "The FBI's forensic accountants traced everything. Not only did my parents get their retirement money back, but they also received compensation from the seized assets. They're actually better off now than before." The church's autumn fundraiser could be heard in the background, with volunteers setting up tables in the courtyard. Mrs. Peterson poked her head into the office, beaming at Sarah. "Are you joining us for the new program launch today?" she asked. Wouldn't miss it, Sarah replied warmly. The program they referred to was the church's new initiative, Safe Haven, designed to help people trapped in situations involving criminal coercion or domestic abuse. Sarah had been instrumental in its development, turning her traumatic experience into something positive that could help others. We already have 3 people who've come forward, Father Richards said, pride evident in his voice. Your story gave them courage, Sarah. Speaking at the support group last month made a real difference. Sarah absently touched the cross necklace she now wore, a gift from her parents after everything was over. I still can't believe how close I came to going through with that wedding, she admitted. If you hadn't noticed the signs, hadn't taken that risk. God works in mysterious ways, Father Richards replied simply. Sometimes he gives us the clarity to see what others might miss. The office door opened again, and Agent Marcus Chen from the FBI stepped in. He had been the lead investigator on the case, and over the months of investigation and trials, he had become a friend to both Sarah and the church community. Sorry I'm late, he said, taking a seat. Just wrapped up some paperwork. The task force officially closed the last of the connected cases today. The entire network is dismantled. Sarah straightened in her chair. Even the international connections. Agent Chen nodded. Interpol picked up the last major player in Singapore yesterday. It's really over, Sarah. You're safe. The relief on Sarah's face was profound. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the church grounds where volunteers were setting up for the fundraiser. Children played on the lawn while their parents worked, their laughter carrying through the glass. I'm teaching again, she said suddenly, turning back to face the others. My kindergarten class is full of 5-year-olds who think the biggest problem in the world is sharing crayons. It's wonderful. Mrs. Peterson wiped a tear from her eye. Life as it should be, she said softly. Father Richards watched as Sarah helped Agent Chen and Mrs. Peterson carry supplies out to the fundraiser tables. The young woman who had once been too terrified to speak now moved with confidence, greeting church members warmly and organizing volunteers with natural leadership. The Safe Haven banner hung proudly over the church entrance, its message clear. You are not alone. Below it, a discreet phone number offered 24/7 support to anyone in need. The program had already partnered with law enforcement, domestic violence shelters, and legal aid services, creating a comprehensive support network. Later that afternoon, as Father Richards prepared for evening mass, he found Sarah sitting quietly in the last pew of the cathedral. She was looking at the altar where, 6 months ago, her life had changed so dramatically. I finally feel free, she said as he sat beside her. Not just from Michael and his threats, but from the fear itself. I'm not a victim anymore, I'm a survivor. And now I can help others survive too. Father Richards patted her hand gently. That's the greatest victory of all, he said. Not just escaping darkness, but bringing light to others who are still finding their way out. As the sunset painted the cathedral in warm colors through the stained glass windows, Sarah's voice joined the choir practicing for evening service. Her clear, strong voice carried up into the ancient rafters, no longer trembling, no longer afraid, but filled with the joy of true freedom. The time came for the exchange of vows, the most sacred part of any wedding ceremony. Father Richards cleared his throat and opened his prayer book, though he had memorized these words decades ago. As he began to speak, he kept his eyes trained on the couple before him, particularly on Sarah's increasingly distressed demeanor. Michael, Father Richards began, please repeat after me. The groom stood tall and confident, his voice never wavering as he recited the traditional vows. His words were perfect, too perfect, the priest thought. They sounded rehearsed, like lines in a play, lacking the emotional tremor that usually accompanied such heartfelt promises. When it was Sarah's turn, the change in atmosphere was palpable. Her voice cracked on the very first word, and she had to stop to take a shuddering breath. Father Richards noticed how she kept her eyes fixed on a point just over Michael's shoulder, refusing to meet his gaze. I, Sarah, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. The microphone attached to Father Richards' podium barely picked up her words. From the back of the church came the sound of someone clearing their throat, a sound that made Sarah jump slightly. Take your time, my child, Father Richards said gently, breaking from the traditional script. He saw Michael's jaw clench at the delay. Sarah tried again. I, Sarah, take you, Michael. She stopped, swallowing hard. Her hands were shaking so badly now that her bouquet made a subtle rustling sound. Father Richards noticed her eyes darting toward her parents again, a look of desperation crossing her face. The cathedral was silent except for the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing. Even the usual shuffling of guests in their seats had ceased, as everyone seemed to sense the tension building at the altar. A baby's cry from somewhere in the back of the church made Sarah flinch, as if she'd been struck. Father Richards observed how Sarah's parents leaned forward in their pew, their faces etched with concern. Her mother's hands were clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had turned white, and her father looked like he was physically restraining himself from standing up. "To be my..." Sarah's voice cracked again. She closed her eyes, tears spilling down her cheeks. Her makeup, carefully applied hours earlier, had begun to streak. When she opened her eyes again, they held a look that Father Richards had seen before, in the eyes of domestic violence survivors who came to the church seeking sanctuary. Michael leaned in slightly, his movement subtle but meaningful. "Continue, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying just enough edge to make it more command than encouragement. Father Richards noticed how his grip on Sarah's hands tightened, and how several of his guests shifted in their seats. Sarah tried to speak again, but no words came out. Instead, a small, choked sound escaped her throat. She glanced at the exit doors again, and this time Father Richards followed her gaze. He noticed how two of Michael's associates had positioned themselves near each door, their stances casual but their attention focused entirely on the altar. The silence stretched on, becoming uncomfortable. Guests began to murmur quietly among themselves. Father Richards could hear snippets of whispered conversations. Just nerves? Cold feet? Poor dear. But he knew it was more than that. 30 years of priesthood had taught him to recognize the difference between wedding day jitters and genuine distress. Sarah's whole body was trembling now, not just her hands. She looked pale enough to faint, and Father Richards noticed she was swaying slightly where she stood. Her breathing had become more erratic, and she kept glancing between her parents and the exit doors with increasing desperation. Michael's patience was clearly wearing thin. His perfect composure showed cracks as he shifted his weight from foot to foot, and his eyes carried a warning when they met Sarah's tear-filled ones. He made another subtle gesture toward the back of the church, and Father Richards heard rather than saw someone move in response. Looking at the bride's face, Father Richards saw something break in her expression, as if she had reached some internal limit. Her lips moved silently, forming words that looked like "I can't" or "help me." It was at that moment that Father Richards made his decision. The safety of this young woman had become more important than the ceremony itself. He had sworn an oath not just to perform marriages, but to protect and guide his flock. Something was terribly wrong here, and he could no longer stand by and watch it unfold. Father Richards closed his prayer book with a decisive snap that echoed through the cathedral. The time for action had come.